You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Michael Schwarz. He's the creator of a documentary called Look Who's Driving about automatic cars, or automatic driving, or self-driving cars. It's hosted on Nova, which is part of the PBS website. So the URL to watch it, which we'll bring up a couple times, should be pbs.org/Nova. And again, it's called Look Who's Driving. So Michael, welcome. How you doing?
Thanks very much. Doing fine, and I appreciate your interest in the show.
Yeah, I think self-driving cars are interesting to a lot of people. So what spurred your interest in creating this documentary?
You know, my interest is actually spurred because we did a series of films a few years ago about the history of Silicon Valley. And as part of that project, we followed a couple of startups that were taking part in a kind of a boot camp that was run by a group called Y Combinator in Silicon Valley. And one of the companies was trying to develop self-driving cars, and it was led by a guy who'd been involved in a couple of other companies beforehand. And we filmed he and two colleagues of his as they tried to retrofit an Audi A4 with basically a self-driving package. His goal at the time was to get the car to drive from San Francisco to Mountain View without human intervention. And he succeeded in that. He raised some money, got the company started. The company was called Cruise. By the time we were late in the editing stage, Cruise had grown from about 3 people to somewhere around 250 or so. And they were acquired by General Motors for about $1 billion. The exact price, varies according to who you ask, but very big sale to General Motors, and they became the spearhead and the focal point for all of GM's self-driving car efforts. And so, getting to see Kyle Vogt was the name of the founder, getting to see Kyle and his colleagues go from really 3 people to several hundred and, zero valuation to something north, something in the area of $1 billion. Made me think that there's a bigger story here and that we should look into it in more depth in a separate film. And we were particularly interested in the technological and engineering challenges that needed to be overcome to make self-driving cars safe, because it seemed to me that until they could meet that threshold, there wasn't really much point in having them. And Nova became a partner in that. We received funding for the show from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in New York, which has supported a lot of our work over the last nearly 25 years. And Nova came in as a partner, a co-producer, and a funder, and of course a distributor. So that's how we got off the ground.
Yeah, and just from what you said so far, I have questions about retrofitting existing cars versus having to do a new car that has all the autonomous driving in it. So that's my first question.
Well, Cruise abandoned the idea.
What's harder, retrofitting or new build?
Well, Cruise abandoned the idea of retrofitting, and one of the reasons they partnered with GM was because GM had the manufacturing capability to make a car that is designed to be self-drive from the start. One of the companies in the program is a company called Zoox out here in the Bay Area. And they're really developing, what most people would understand as a robotaxi for use in urban areas. And a big part of their business plan is really to design the car. Well, I would hesitate even to call it a car. Is to design a quote unquote transportation platform. That has no controls, and that's got people facing each other, what they call carriage seating, and where the vehicle is, conceived from the ground up as something that's going to be controlled by computers. So, my sense is that that's the way it's going to head eventually. I think for the time being, there's a lot of retrofitting going on because it's the easiest way to test whether the software and hardware systems can work together. But I think eventually, these capabilities are going to be built in. And I also think that it's very unlikely that these vehicles are going to be sold anytime soon to individual consumers. Tesla notwithstanding, that's a whole another issue. But I think most of the companies, see the benefits of self-driving as being that cars can stay on the road, maybe not quite 24 hours a day, but most of the day. And one of the biggest sources of waste right now that we have with individual cars is that most of them spend about 95% of their lives parked somewhere. And we only use them, 4 to 5% of the time they're in motion. The rest of the time they're in our driveways or garages or parking lots at work. And it's very inefficient way to build a transportation system.
Yeah, I didn't realize the usage percentage was so low. Huh. So you said about 95%?
95% unused. Yeah.
Well, in a way,
idle.
In a way, that's, for the number of cars out there, that's a good thing. If they were 100% utilized or even 50% with the number of existing cars, that would be horrible, but we wouldn't need nearly that much capacity, is my guess. So a lot fewer cars available much more of the time is better.
That's why nobody knows whether these, self-driving cars are going to increase congestion or reduce it. I think you can find people on either side of that question.
Oh, is that really a concern? I mean, why would they increase congestion? Because people are not going to. Will they use cars more often?
Yeah. The easier you make transportation, the more people tend to use it. So there are scenarios that came out showing that usage could actually increase, congestion could increase. I think the pollution question is different because more and more people see these becoming all electric at some point. But there's still debate about what the actual long-term impact would be.
Well, has there been any study of Uber and Lyft and what that's done? Has it made people take more trips versus their normal?
It's dramatically increased congestion in places like San Francisco. There have been studies, and the studies show a very bad impact on congestion. A lot more cars roaming around. Yes.
Oh wow. Yeah, I hate when there's those counterintuitive things that happen. Or those trade-offs. But I guess they're there.
Yes, they are.
So,
the rosier scenario, of course, is that there'll be more ride sharing, there'll be more efficient transportation, there'll be less congestion, there'll be less pollution, and it's possible that could happen. It's just that we don't know. And so often with the introduction of any new technology, there are unintended consequences, and you don't know till you do it.
Well, maybe the sweet spot then would be private ownership, but a high degree of autonomy in the driving or autonomous driving, because then, I don't know, it would be easier for people, but they still would have to get in their car and go somewhere. So maybe that would prevent them from using the car a lot more. It was just easier to use and therefore autonomous. They could take longer trips, but I don't know. I don't know what the implication would be, but I guess no one knows.
Nobody does right now.
What about the safety standard? When we say, autonomous cars will be more safe, what does that mean? I mean, it seems like the perspective is that any accidents involving autonomous vehicles would instantly demonize them to the point where they wouldn't want to be used. So the standard seems to be the bar is a lot higher for them versus human drivers.
I think that's true. I think there's a general concern about handing over control to computers. At the same time, we do it every time we get in an airplane. Nobody worries a whole lot that, that a computerized system by and large is flying that airplane most of the time. the safety issue is a crucial one because the industry likes to say correctly that there are, at the moment, somewhere between 35 and 40,000 deaths per year in this country, and it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.2 million, 1.3 million around the world. And that autonomous cars don't get drunk, they don't get distracted, they don't get drowsy. And in theory, they could eliminate, some, if not all, of those deaths. But the challenge is, though, that even though there are all of those fatalities, the fact is that human drivers only experience a fatality once every 100 million miles. The reason there are so many is that we collectively drive so many miles. But to get a autonomous car to be able to drive 100 million miles without a fatality is a very, very high bar, and nobody is close to that at the moment.
But what does that 100 million mile mark do to an individual autonomous car's track record? Again, is it the perception that if there's even a few accidents that involve autonomous cars that people would say, "Oh, it's not working, forget it." I mean, what do you think would happen?
Most polls show that most members of the public, as many as 75%, are wary of getting into these vehicles. They're scared of them. So, any single accident in which there's a fatality involving a self-driving car, like the one in the Uber crash in Tempe, Arizona, that stokes those public fears. But the issue is that these cars haven't been on the road long enough to have a track record where you can even gauge that level of performance. So a lot of it's done in simulation and on test tracks. And, while they're getting more and more mileage on the road, they're driving in, limited kind of controlled conditions. I shouldn't say controlled because there's, many of them are driving in places like San Francisco, but they're sort of circumscribed conditions in which they're driving routes they know, and they're being tested, and they can't just go from, any random place to any other random place. They're often being driven in good weather, in good road conditions. So we just don't have the data yet to know. If you ask how are we going to know when these cars meet that standard, it's very hard to get a clear answer on how we know when they're, safe enough. So as a society, we're going to have to make a decision about the trade-offs and, what level of risk we're willing to accept. Well, every time we get in a vehicle, we accept some level of risk. So the question is,
right.
How much?
Well, what level of autonomy is actually in use? People. I'm sure there's a lot of people that say, "Oh, I've heard about self-driving cars," and then there's other people that believe that they're already on the road, driving all over the place. But what's the reality of it?
The reality is there aren't self-driving cars on the road yet. There are some that are being tested, but cars like the Tesla with autopilot, they're what's known in the industry as level 2 autonomy, which means that they can, automatically control two driving functions. In the case of the Tesla, it's steering, staying in a lane, and it's speed control, maintaining a safe distance behind the vehicle in front of it. But the human driver is still responsible for ensuring the safety of the car. So one of the issues that has come up with those systems is that people develop a false sense of confidence or security because they work pretty well, but they don't work perfectly. And for instance, they're not very good at seeing vehicles that cross their path. They're not very good at seeing stationary objects in front of them. And when somebody fails to pay attention, even for 5 or 10 seconds, that can lead to fatalities, and it's done that. Companies like Waymo and Zoox and Cruise and many others are therefore trying to leapfrog the step where there's any human responsibility at all, and get to the point where the car itself can be fully responsible, for not causing any accidents. Because most of the research shows that it's very difficult to be, sort of somewhat relaxed and super vigilant at the same time. I mean, I think anybody who's gotten in a car and driven it knows that when a dangerous situation arises, it happens very fast. And even if you're really paying attention, it can be difficult to avoid it. So if you're in a car in which you think the car is handling everything and suddenly the car isn't handling it well, it's sort of completely counterintuitive to think that somebody's going to be immediately able to, go from that somewhat relaxed and inattentive state to, being hypervigilant and able to take really sudden evasive action in a safe way.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. I didn't think about that. That's true. If you're sitting there letting the car drive and relaxing, you're not probably likely to react well, even if you could react quickly, because you weren't. You didn't have a history of what was going on a second before.
Yeah, it's hard to be both a passenger and a driver at the same time. You sort of need to be one or the other. And if you're a passenger, then it's difficult to suddenly be expected to take over the driving role. And that's what happens in level 2 cars.
So it may have to be total autonomy or not.
That's what many people believe, yes. Yeah.
Well, it just seems like a lot scarier of a thing to be in a car with no steering wheel and no way for me to control it. It's totally controlled by computer. I guess if I accept it, then I will relax and that's that. But I don't know, it just seems like a much harder sell. It's a loss of independence and ownership and all the other things. Yeah.
And psychologically, that's the barrier the industry needs to overcome. I mean, in theory, these vehicles have 360-degree sensors, and they've got, different kinds of sensors. So they are seeing at all times everything that's happening around the car. And they're one of the things we show in the program is, some tests that are being done by a group at Stanford that are trying to figure out how to use computers to, make sure that a car can perform at the limits of its capabilities in terms of maintaining tire traction with the road so that if it needs to take evasive action, it could do so safely. And in some ways, computers are, what they do is they basically study race car driver behavior and then kind of translate that into computer instructions that control the car. The great thing about that is that once you have the code right, it can be translated to a fleet of vehicles, fairly quickly, and they all have that capability, in a way that would far exceed what any sort of ordinary human driver could do. But getting there is difficult, and in order to trust the cars, we need to see that they perform reliably under all cases. And the issue is, what's kind of known in the industry as edge cases, that, just people do crazy things. If everybody followed the rules, it would be, reasonably simple to program cars to, to behave in a way that's safe. The challenge is when people sort of jump into the street in the middle of two parked cars, or people drive the wrong way down a street, or there's all kinds of crazy stuff that happens. It's very hard to anticipate, and therefore it's very hard to train the cars to know how to respond to that.
Well, one scenario I've thought of is, let's say autonomous vehicles start and they're 50% safer than human drivers. And then eventually I would think that the states and the government would legislate that you're not allowed to drive a car except in emergencies, and you have to use autonomous vehicles. I could see a complete changeover at some point if that was the case. Do you think that's possible?
It could, it could be possible, but I think we're decades away from being able to do that.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people are going to want to continue to drive their cars. Especially in a country like this where, there's such weight placed on individual rights. I think it's going to be very hard for governments to take people's cars away. So I think that transition would be a very long one, if it's ever going to happen.
So what other insights have you gotten from making the film that you didn't have before you made the film?
Gosh, it's so many different ways to answer that question. I think it's hard not to be impressed by the kind of passion and dedication of people who are trying to make these cars safe. It's a huge technological and engineering challenge. and there are a lot of incredibly smart people working on the problem. Many of them, interestingly enough, got their start in some competitions that were sponsored by the Department of Defense, which, this whole industry in some ways goes back, it goes back even longer than what's known as the DARPA Grand Challenges. But, back in the middle of the last century, people were thinking that self-driving cars were going to be kind of guided by mag tracks that were going to be buried in highways. So the idea, there's been a desire for a long time to create these sorts of systems, and it's been a challenge to figure out how. The real impetus came in the early 2004 and 5, and then 2007, when the Defense Department announced competitions to develop self-driving cars because they wanted to figure out a way to keep soldiers safe on the battlefield. And so they went to, universities and other research centers, and basically they initially had $1 million prize and for, any car that could sort of autonomously finish a course, and nobody managed to do it. And then the next year they doubled the prize, and people did get better. And then in 2007 they did what they launched what they called an urban challenge, where they have stoplights and more of the kinds of intersections. And the first two courses were in the desert. The urban challenge was on a course that more resembled an urban environment. And a lot of the people in the industry today participated in those races back in 2004, 5, and 7. So the government really, seeded a lot of the work that's going on now, and a lot of the talent emerged from that crucible. So, I think what's impressed me is one, the importance of the role that the government played in launching this new industry. Two, the kind of sort of brilliance and fortitude that a lot of the people in the field, have, and their tenacity at sort of chipping away at these problems. There's been incredible progress made, but at the same time, getting to the point where these cars can be safer than human drivers, that's still, I think, we're still quite a ways from that. Will it happen? I think it certainly could, but I think it's going to be a while before it does. Seems to me what's most likely is that, and I'm really just echoing here, what we've learned from experts in the field, but trucking is one area where, we may see sort of early adoption because, highway driving is actually much more simple than urban or suburban driving, on-ramp to off-ramp. That's something we're pretty good at already. And so, that could make sense, where you've got long-haul truckers that, can easily get drowsy. It's going to be easier to do that than to figure out how to navigate the streets of Manhattan or Boston or San Francisco or Chicago or wherever you want to, LA, wherever you want to talk about. And then I think in environments where cars don't need to go more than 20 or 25 miles an hour, and there's not a lot of traffic, and not a lot of surprises, they could also make sense. And there we're talking about industrial parks or college campuses or retirement communities, or airports, where shuttles function. That could be another place where we start to see them sooner rather than later. But, to go anywhere, anytime, fully autonomous vehicle, that's I suspect further away. But, the companies like some of these companies are, they're getting closer every day. So, the question is, as you asked earlier, if one of these vehicles is involved in an accident, where's our tolerance level? Do we need to get to the point where there are no deaths before we say, okay, these are an overall benefit to society, or if they can get us from 35,000 annual deaths to 25,000, is that good enough? Are we willing to accept that? Right. Because 10,000 lives have been saved. So,
all right. Well, question here on the fully autonomous vehicles like Waymo, et cetera. There's no steering wheel, no anything. What are some of the beneficial trade-offs that we can get in terms of safety because of no steering wheel, no need for a driver to sit in a certain seat and location? I would think they could use a lot of that stuff to their advantage to make a much safer vehicle.
Well, eventually, I mean, right now they do have steering wheels because most of them have safety drivers who can take over in event of emergency. So, at the moment, the Waymos driving, Pacificas and, but most companies, I don't know of any company that's right now testing without a steering wheel at all, although I think most of them want to get to the point where there are no, driver controls, where there's no steering wheel, no brake, no accelerator, and so on. I think the advantages are they can start thinking of safety within the compartment differently, and how airbags are deployed differently, how the passenger compartment would collapse differently, and I think companies like Zoox, which are rethinking what the vehicle is, are really focusing on some of those questions. Yes, they do think there's a big safety. Zoox has. We interviewed somebody from Zoox whose title is Safety Innovation Officer, a guy named Mark Rosekind, who used to work for for NHTSA, the government agency that's responsible for highway safety. So his job is really to think about precisely, what are the answers to the question you've asked.
Okay, yeah, I just wondered if anything was apparent or jumps out as a nice trade-off now that you don't have that stuff in the car, but we're not there yet. So.
Well, you're not going to slam your chest into the steering wheel, right, for a start.
Yep.
And you could probably begin making the windscreens different, so there's less likelihood of, a head smashing into glass. And, I honestly don't know the answer to the question, but I know that they're trying to figure it out.
Very good. So what do you think are some of from comments from viewers, like what are the things that people find most interesting about the documentary? We mainly hear from people who say nice things to us. Oh, good.
So, WGBH would be getting more of the viewer comments. I haven't seen many viewer comments yet, but so the answer that I can give to that question is mainly anecdotal, mainly from friends and colleagues, who the ones who've written to us, think it was a very compelling program, and it's a complicated subject. So we worked really hard to try to, explain the different levels of autonomy, to explain what the car needs to do in order to drive autonomously, to talk about both, the promise and the perils of the technology, and I like to think that, whether people know a good deal about autonomous vehicles or know nothing at all, that they'll get something out of watching the show, which, they can see, I think it's at least another month on PBS.org/Nova.
Okay, excellent. So, again, PBS.org/Nova is where they can see it. It's called Look Who's Driving. And, Mike, I appreciate you coming on the program. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your interest. I really appreciate it.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.